Good day to one and all, and welcome to Encyclopedia Hermetica, Part 35. Today we're going to be picking up where we left off at the end of Part 33, which means today we've got to cover a number of conflicts between the Second and the Third Punic War, and then onwards. So, in other words, we've got to cover the convoluted series of events which led to the conquest of Greece by Rome. So, just before jumping into this, I should mention that our best source for this period is Livy. He's not the only one, but he's our best. And it's not just the works of Livy himself, but chiefly what's called the Perioeci. These are basically summaries from a much later period, abridged digests, if you will. And since so many of Livy's works don't survive, we depend on these later summaries to fill in the blanks for us. Now, the Perioeci aren't the only works that summarize Livy's history. The Egyptian town of Oxyrhynchus has yielded to us a similar summary of books, 37 to 40 and 48 to 55, on a scroll of papyrus that is now in the British Museum. Nevertheless, this epitome is physically damaged and incomplete, so this leaves us with the Perioeci as our most important tool for reconstructing the general scope of Livy's monumental history of Rome. I only tell you this as a constant reminder to how tenuous our grasp on history actually is. This has been a constant theme in our time together. The wooden roof of a single monastery in the Middle Ages covered an incalculable storage of wealth in the form of richly detailed manuscript copies. And it was not so rare of an event that these buildings went up in flames, whether by accident or by malice. So, we're really extremely fortunate to have these kinds of quote-unquote pagan works, scanty as they are. The late great novelist Umberto Eco wrote In the Name of the Rose, and that's a wonderful book about this concept, specifically in regards to Aristotle's lost works on comedy. If Jesus never laughed in the Gospels, what good is comedy to Christianity? Anyhow, I digress here. So, in the year quingentesimo quinquagesimo primo ab urbe condita, that is 551 ordinal years after the founding of Rome in 753 BC, aka 200 BC, only a few months after peace was made with Carthage, a second and more serious war broke out between Rome and King Philip V, the King of Macedonia. Philip V, who had been in the line of Alexander the Great himself, had been quite a thorn in the side of the Romans throughout the duration of the Second Punic War. He signed a treaty with Carthage during Rome's lowest point, in 215, just a single year after Cannae, and this caused the Romans a good deal of grief in Illyria, in modern Croatia, and stirred up plenty of trouble in Greece proper, particularly in the Aegean Sea. We could say that Rome had first been embroiled in the affairs of Greece during the First Macedonian War of 214 to 205, but this conflict merely ended in a status quo antebellum. In 205 BC, two of Rome's allies, Pergamum and Rhodes, had begun fighting Philip V in what's called the Cretan War. Now, the Second Macedonian War, starting in 200, was initiated by the ruling Roman consul at the time, Publius Sulpicius Galba, with Gaius Aurelius Cotta at his side. And before this point, Galba had led a number of successful cavalry raids into Macedonia as part of the First Macedonian War. But this this pretty much describes the whole of Rome's contribution to that war. Romans were like American military advisors. They only contributed enough to help their allies make a difference. They didn't field an entire army proper. Naturally, the people of Rome were unhappy to start up a fresh war before they'd even recovered from the ravages of the Second Punic War. Plebeian concerns of the aristocracy using perpetual war to consolidate power was a thing. As it was then, so it is now. But the Senate and Galba carried their plan for state vengeance, and the Second Macedonian War against Philip V was launched. When the consuls drew their lots for the consular command, as was customary, this was done by chance, Galba once again obtained the Macedonian province. Galba was given permission to draw his forces from the army which Scipio Africanus had brought back from Africa, but everyone was exhausted and eager to settle down rather than take on another huge risk for greater wealth and fame. After having mustered enough of a force, Galba sailed from Brundisium to Apollonia in modern Albania, as per his plans to invade Macedonia from the west. Macedonia at the time was, like much of the world, a very green place. And ideally, if you wanted to get your whole army somewhere, it was easier to go by ship than by land. And I think that should probably go without saying, but it's easy to forget how impassable much of the world was until the Industrial Revolution. Anyhow, upon arrival, Publius Sulpicius Galba met some Athenian ambassadors who asked for his protection against the Macedonians, to which he kindly agreed. The Romans didn't have to play divide and conquer because the Greeks were already divided. Athens was always playing this game of making larger powers fight one another to stay afloat, but by this point, they were more or less resting on their laurels. They were a bastion of culture, not of military might. In the spring of 199 BC, Sulpicius Galba advanced his army through the rustic lands of West Macedonia, where all the settlements along the way capitulated to Rome. Very few put up a fight. Now, throughout this campaign, Philip and Galba had been ignorant to one another's movements until, perchance, a Macedonian scouting party ran into a Roman one, thus erupting into a skirmish. Two armies set up camp at some distance from each other, and a series of battles took place, one of which was most deadly to the Roman forces. This event was followed by another cavalry engagement, in which the Romans were routed, but the Macedonians, too eager to pursue the enemy, quickly found themselves flanked and forced to retreat. During this flank and rout maneuver, Philip nearly got himself killed, and immediately sent to Galba to ask for a truce. Sulpicius Galba took some time to think about it, but by the time everyone got up the next day, they'd quickly discovered that Philip and his army had fled their camp in the night. So, from there, Galba spent his time securing the territory and taking a number of towns, but he didn't directly engage Philip. In preparation for winter, Galba returned to Apollonia on the Adriatic coast. Now, although this campaign was considered merely a minor success, uneventful with minor losses, it did convince the Aetolians, in mainland Greece, one of Philip's major allies, to ally with Rome. In 198 BC, Sulpicius Galba was relieved in Macedonia by another commander when he returned to Rome. Now, this commander was named Flamininus, and as far as I'm aware, he was the first Roman to be worshipped in cult in foreign lands alongside the goddess Roma. From this point on, we start seeing an extremely complex diplomatic process take place. And I'm not going to get into the details of it all. There's just too many obscure names and dates and client kingdoms, and I just don't think anybody's going to retain any of them if I just start spouting them off without recourse to a map. As a general rule of thumb, what we see happening is reverse Balkanization in the Balkans. All the small minor powers start getting sucked up into the larger snowballing powers of Rome and their chief competition in the Mediterranean, the Hellenistic successor states. In 197 BC, Flamininus defeats Philip at the Battle of Cynocephaly in Thessaly. The common narrative is that the Roman legions rendered the Macedonian phalanx obsolete in this battle, but the Battle of Cynocephaly was too close of a call to make that kind of claim. After having fully subdued Philip, Rome sent 10 legates to Greece. And here are the peace conditions that they gave to Philip. And I quote from Livy's book 33. Ut omnes Graecorum civitates, quae in Europa, quaeque in Asia essent, libertatem ac suas haberent leges. So that all the cities of the Greeks, both in Europe and in Asia, should have liberty and their own laws. Quae earum subdicione Philippi fuissent, praesidia ex iis Philippus deduceret vacuasque traderet Romanis ante isthmiorum tempus, that the places which were under the jurisdiction of Philip be rid of Philip's garrisons and emptied for the Romans before the time of the Isthmian Games. Captivos transfugasque rederet Romanis, et naves omnes tectas traderet praetor quinque, ne plus quinque milia armatorum haberet neve elephantum ulum. Captives and defectors should be returned to the Romans, and all but 5 covered ships must be surrendered. Nor should he, Philip, have any more than 5,000 soldiers, and not a single elephant. Bellum extra Macedoniae fines ne iniusu senatus gereret. 1000 talenta daret populo Romano. So he must not wage a war outside of Macedonia's boundaries without the Senate's permission. Moreover, he must give 1,000 talents of silver to the Roman people. And so it was. They then used the Isthmian Games to celebrate their new quote-unquote alliances. Now, the reason I'm reading this to you in both Latin and in English is because treaties tend to be the kinds of things with which historians take little poetic license. So they are these sorts of verbal axes mundorum through time. What you're hearing here is the wording that was likely hashed out in the Senate, albeit they'd have enacted it in Greek, of course. Bi- or even trilingual decrees were common practice at the time. Laws and treaties are entirely magical constructs. And here by magical, I'm following the Crowley definition, which is that magic is any willful act which enacts change in consensus reality. Legal action is a kind of magical action, like it or not. This is the word binding flesh. This is the word molding history. So that's what happened in Greece. In a few fell swoops, all of fractured Greece was intertwined by the strictures of Roman diplomacy. At least those parts of Greece which weren't already Roman allies. Not long after, in 195, Marcus Porcius Cato subjects eastern Hispania. Anyhow, 2 years later, at 193 BC, Galba was sent as an ambassador to the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III. If you remember back to my talk about Greeks and Jews, this Antiochus III was the father of Antiochus IV, who'd eventually desecrate the Second Temple and prompt the Maccabean revolt. Now, along the way, the Romans stopped to have a chit-chat with Eumenes II of Pergamon, who urged the Romans to attack Antiochus at once. Again, this is typical. The Romans show up to an area with a bunch of squabbling kings, and they side with the underdog to remove the biggest threat and secure their own power. This is just how things are done. The U.S. didn't want to fight the Russians in Afghanistan, so they propped up and supported the Taliban in a position of local rulership. This is but one of countless examples. Though, to be fair, the Romans actually here didn't attack Antiochus. Now, obviously, the Seleucids had long been trying to undermine Rome's influence in the region, and they got their chance as soon as some of Rome's allies from the previous war, the mainland Aetolians, were feeling slighted at not having been offered any land for helping out the Romans in the war against Philip. Those dust clouds being kicked up in the west signaled an impending domino effect for the east. Before this point, the Hellenistic kingdoms maintained equilibrium through universal plunder, but that was all about to change. So, these Aetolians, from Greece proper, they defected to Antiochus, thus sowing the seeds of the Roman-Syrian War in 192. But there had been other incidents leading up to this one. Now, while in Pergamum, our old friend Sulpicius Galba got really sick and bedridden. So after finally getting better, which took months, he resumed his travels toward Antiochus. So he's going through Turkey down toward Syria. Along the way, in Ephesus, they met with an ambassador who had been granted full power by Antiochus to negotiate with the Romans. After a series of not-so-successful negotiations, Galba returned to home, and the Senate decided further negotiations weren't possible, and war with Antiochus was inevitable. Alright, so the Roman-Syrian War, aka the Roman-Seleucid War of 192 to 188 BC. This was a military conflict between the Roman Republic and the Seleucid Empire. The fighting took place in Greece proper, in the Aegean Sea, and of course in Asia Minor. You might argue that this was the outcome of an ancient kind of quote-unquote Cold War between both powers, which had begun to flare up in 196 BC. Before the war had openly erupted, the period was marked by Roman and Seleucid attempts to settle their spheres through complex webs of alliance and intrigue with the remaining minor Greek powers. For example, Antiochus III had made an alliance with Philip V in 203, the Philip we were just discussing, to help one another conquer Egypt and to take it away from the young Ptolemy V, who by this point had control over a small handful of islands in the Aegean. Nevertheless, Philip made this treaty before the outbreak of the Second Macedonian War, by the end of which the reality had changed and Philip was in no position to go against Rome. Philip, humbled by Rome twice, remained until his death an unfailing ally/client king of Rome, and this would be problematic for Antiochus during the Roman-Syrian War. Here would be a good place to tell you that throughout all this, Hannibal was living in Syria with Antiochus as a kind of refugee from Carthage. So there's some additional bad blood brewing between Rome and Antiochus. Very quickly, to give you an idea of what the world looked like at the outset of the war, going from east to west, Caria, Lydia, Mysia, and all of Thrace north of the Bosphorus was under the control of the Seleucidan-Reich, along with Aetolia and some of the surrounding regions in northern Greece. Now, on the side of the Römische Allianz, we've got Rhodes and Pergamum in Turkey, Peloponnesian Greece, also known as Achaia, and in the north of Greece, Chalcedon, Macedonia, and Illyria. Now, the Greeks were a haughty people, and it's safe to assume they were not too pleased with Roman dominion over large parts of Greece. So, Antiochus wanted to play on this advantage. Now, immediately after saying that, I should say that it's probably a bad idea to look at them all as a whole or national group. I was just trying to be facetious with the German. Each state had its own grievances with this or that party and allied accordingly. One story goes, according to Aulus Gellius, that when Antiochus III was showing off to Hannibal the gigantic and well-armed army that he had created to invade Greece, he asked him if they would be enough for the Roman Republic, to which Hannibal answered, "I think all this will be enough. Yes, quite enough for the Romans, even though they are most avaricious." Well, TLDR, it wasn't enough, and so when Antiochus decided he'd take an army over the Hellespont, Xerxes style, and despite the classic move setting himself up at Thermopylae, Antiochus was crushed by the Romans. This defensive advantage did nothing to cement Roman hegemony over the Greek mainland. The Romans pursued Antiochus's forces back to Asia. Next, a joint Roman-Rhodian fleet engaged and defeated the Seleucid fleet commanded by Hannibal in 2 major naval battles. After some more warring in Asia Minor, the Seleucids fought against the armies of Rome and Pergamum at Magnesia. Rome won, Antiochus lost, and that was that. This was probably the best example of Roman military superiority, because while Philip had a slight numerical edge at Cynocephaly, at Magnesia the Romans were outnumbered by a greater degree. Given the presence of Galatian allies in Asia Minor, I don't think 60 to 70,000 is unrealistic, while the Romans had only about 30 to 40,000 men. These losses were disastrous for the Seleucids, and they'd never really recover from this blow again. Antiochus was forced to agree to some serious terms. Among these were the Treaty of Apamea, which forced Antiochus to pay 15,000 talents, or 990,000 pounds of silver, and to abandon his territory west of the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Turkey. Rhodes took control over Caria and Lycia, while Pergamum gained northern Lycia and all of Antiochus's territories left behind in Asia Minor. As a main result of this war, the Roman Republic had bootstrapped itself into a position of hegemony over Greece and Asia Minor, leaving it as the only remaining power around the Mediterranean Sea, the biggest inland sea in the world, which, soon enough, the Romans would start calling Mare Nostrum, our sea. So this is all fleshed out in Latin by Livy and in the Greek by Polybius. If you're really interested in looking at the sources, which are not primary, but they're the best we have, go looking in Livy and Polybius. Now, in regards to our old friend Hannibal. When Antiochus seemed to be getting ready to hand him over to the Romans after a series of humiliating defeats, Hannibal fled to Crete, then back to Anatolia, where he sought refuge with the king of Bithynia. During one of the naval battles that he won over Rome's allies, Hannibal had allegedly had the ingenious idea of filling large pots with venomous snakes and launching them onto enemy ships. This is one of those great examples of early biological/psychological warfare, along with catapulting dead bodies over walls or sticking them in enemy water supplies. There was no lack of creativity in regards to violence, that's for sure. After all, Hannibal won a couple of other battles on the very fringes of the Roman world, and eventually the Romans arrived to interfere and threatened Bithynia into giving up Hannibal. Now, at some point between 183 and 181, we really aren't sure when because of the conflicting sources, Hannibal died, either at his own hands by poisoning or from an infectious wound. What we know for sure is that Hannibal was determined to not fall into Roman hands, so suicide was probably the case. Thus ended the life of one of the greatest tacticians ever known to man. No individual single-handedly spread more fear and panic throughout the entire Roman world until at least Mithridates of Pontus reared his ugly head with a surprise genocide of 80,000 to 150,000 Roman citizens in 88 BC. The very expression we use today of, quote, barbarians at the gates is a rehash of the Latin idiom Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal's at the gates. He was so hated, he was practically admired by the poets of Rome. He was even revered with statues in Rome as a reminder that foes worthy of Rome are a reality. In fact, Hannibal was so scary to the Romans that they had adopted a bunch of Greek religious rituals and forms in order to further appease the gods in their favor. They were just covering all their bases. Hannibal had done for Rome what Rome could not do for itself. It unified the aristocracy against a common foe. Almost everyone wanted a piece of Hannibal because they knew he was so great that the glory would be eternal. But nobody was jumping into the fray. Now, it wouldn't be until 30 BC that the very last of the Greek-controlled part of the Mediterranean, in Egypt, would fall to Roman dominion. But what we've seen then is that during this period, the Mediterranean itself is like a fishbowl full of fish, and Rome just keeps growing and growing while all the other fish start running out of space and resources. The final step in this process would be the Third Punic War, Rome's final blow against its mortal enemy across the pond, Carthage. So let's get into that because it isn't too complicated, and I like to get it out of the way so we can move on to some other less vanilla topics, if you will. Because let's be fair, you can get this sort of information anywhere. Now, we need to keep in mind that there's a good 3 to 4 decades between Rome's conquest of Philip V and Antiochus III. But there isn't a good deal of action going on between these decades either. Now, in the decades between the Second and Third Punic War, Rome was engaged in all manner of business conquering the Hellenistic empires, and they were also busying themselves ruthlessly suppressing the folks of Hispania to the west. Naturally, Hispania wasn't a single country, There were many local allies going back to the Second Punic War who benefited from Rome's aggressions here. Now, Carthage, having been stripped of allies and land, namely Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain, was suffering under a crippling League of Nations-style indemnity of 200 silver talents every year for 50 years. So remember, a talent is a warship and its crew. They had to fork over 200 of these every year for half a century. This may have been okay if Carthage had maintained its own mines in Spain, but they'd lost them all in the previous wars. Now, at Rome, during this period, there was one particularly stubborn senator we all know and love as Cato the Elder. Cato was a hardcore traditionalist. He was a staunch conservative and a legendary curmudgeon. Now, if we want to put a positive spin on that, we could say he had great auctoritas, gravitas, and respect for the mos maiorum. In any case, after every speech he would give in the Senate, he would finish with the line, Ceterum autem, censeo, Carthaginem esse delendam, which translates as, furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. In other words, Rome never forgets. Now, the peace treaty, which had been signed at the end of the Second Punic War, forced all border disputes involving Carthage to be arbitrated by the Roman Senate, and as a result, in the 5 decades between the Second and Third Punic Wars, Carthage took every border dispute it had to Rome. Problem for Carthage was, however, that Carthage's chief enemy was a client kingdom of Rome, Numidia. So, obviously, in addition to the crushing indemnity with which they'd yoked Carthage, the old SPQR almost infallibly made decisions in the favor of Numidia. Now, if this was enough to get Hitler jumping into World War II, this was enough to seriously piss off Carthage as well. Now, by 151 BC, the Carthaginian debt to Rome was officially repaid. So from a Punic perspective, the treaty had expired. Rome, on the other hand, enjoyed its free handouts, which would eventually come to be known as the Punic Curse. They like to think of this treaty as a permanent declaration of Carthaginian vassalage, more in line with the arrangement Rome had with its Italian allies. Now, given Carthage didn't want to continue going down the path of extortion, they stopped the payments, and immediately the main incentive the Romans had to keep peace with Carthage flittered away. Carthage was tolerated only insofar as they paid rent, but with the payments having dried up, the landlord was ready to evict. Now, atop all of this, by the middle of the 2nd century BC, the population of Rome itself was about 400,000 and rising fast, especially with the massive influx of slaves from all around the Mediterranean. Keeping these people well fed and entertained was becoming a major challenge, and the fertile soil around Carthage loomed in the Roman mind as the most productive and accessible agricultural land yet to be put under Roman control. So, in the year 151 BC, Numidia launched yet another raid on Carthaginian soil, and in retaliation, Carthage launched a large 25,000-man military expedition to repel them. Now, Carthage lost this, and this was sort of the nail in the coffin for them, politically and economically speaking. This obviously annoyed Rome, and so Carthage was charged with another 50-year indemnity to be paid to Numidia. In order to avoid a war, Carthage had to satisfy the Roman people. Kiss it. Apologize. Needless to say, they failed to kiss it and apologize. Rome's terms were continuously shifting goalposts, which the Carthaginians predictably refused. This is probably the first major incidence of the Romans acting completely in bad faith. Where they were aggressive before, they were at least honest about it. Now, in 149 BC, Rome declared war against Carthage. The Carthaginians tried all sorts of stuff to appease Rome, like sending 300 children of Carthaginian nobility as hostages to Rome. But even after this, the Punic city of Utica defected to Rome, and a Roman army of 80,000 soldiers garrisoned itself there in preparation for a conflict. The consuls then demanded the complete disarmament of Carthage. And after those had been forked over, Rome then demanded the impossible. That the city of Carthage itself be moved at least 16 kilometers inland, while the old city was to be burned. Naturally, this was the straw that broke the proverbial Berber camel's back. The Carthaginians abandoned negotiations, and their city was immediately besieged. The siege on Carthage, led by consuls Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorius, consisted of a two-pronged attack, but these were thwarted by the army of the Carthaginian generals Hasdrubal and Hamilcar. Censorius lost over 500 men to a cavalry raid near Lake Tunis while collecting timber, and an even worse disaster befell the Romans when their fleet was set ablaze by Carthaginian fireships. After a number of defeats and failures, Manilius was replaced by the consul Calpurnius Piso Caesonius in 149, and not long after that, Piso was replaced as consul by Scipio Aemilianus. Carthage endured a siege from 149 BC to the spring of 146 BC, when Scipio Aemilianus successfully took the city. The Carthaginians were gradually pushed back by the Roman military and destroyed. Okay, so wrapping up. Naturally, most Carthaginians had died from starvation during the latter part of the siege, with the rest being slain in the final 6 days of fighting. Once the war was over, the remaining 50,000 or so Carthaginians were put in fetters and carried off as slaves. Carthage was then systematically razed for 17 days. The walls and buildings were ground into dust, and the remaining Carthaginian territories were annexed by Rome. There's a popular myth from the 19th century that the Roman forces sowed the city's fields with salt to ensure that nothing would grow there again. First off, salt was expensive. Our word salary doesn't come from the Latin sal for nothing. Secondly, if they did do this, archaeologists could find it. And thirdly, the whole intent to take Carthage in the first place was for their agricultural land. The sources tell us the land surrounding Carthage was declared ager publicus, and thus could be shared between local Roman and Italian farmers. Before Rome annexed Egypt, this part of North Africa would serve as Rome's most vital source of thermodynamic energy. Though, I suppose, depending on the season, Sicily also held that honor. A century later, the desolation that was Carthage was rebuilt as a Roman city by Julius Caesar, and this would serve as one of the main cities of Roman Africa by the time of the empire. Alright, so I'm going to stop talking about politics and war for a minute to talk about some culture, about war and politics. The following poem I'm going to read to you comes from the Latin poet Aeneas, who is actually contemporaneous to all the stuff that we've been talking about. His dates are 239 BC to around 169 BC. And by and large, he's considered the very father of Latin poetry. Now, the only stuff of Aeneas's that actually survives, like in most authors' cases, are fragments here and there cited by other authors. They're his tweets, if you will. In this case, we've got the 1st century Latin author Aulus Gellius quoting a classic Quintus Ennius poem. So, this poem is about the response at home of war and the shift in tone in the forum. This has often been tied to the response following the battle at Cannae, or perhaps Trasimene, which led to the naming of Quintus Fabius Maximus as state dictator. Even if you yourself are a classicist, there's a good chance that you've probably never heard this one because it's a real buried gem. Not exactly the type of thing to show up randomly on a Latin exam like Virgil or Horace or Quintilian. So I'll read it in Latin and then I'll give my own translation in English. You'll have to forgive me if I butcher the meter. I haven't exactly mastered them all. So anyways, here it goes. Proilia promulgantur. Battles are announced. Pellitur remedio sapientia, vi geritur res. Spernitur orator bonus, horridus miles amatur. How doctis dictis certantes, nec maledictis, miscent intercesse inimicitias agitantes. Non ex iure manu concertum, sed magis fero, rem repetunt regnumque petunt, vadunt solida vi. So, in English, battles are announced. Wisdom is driven off center stage. A state governed by force. The noble orator is spurned, the wretched soldier loved. Battling with hardly learned words, nor ill ones, they mingle amongst one another, stirring up enmities, not waging war with the law, but with iron. They seek justice, and they seek the kingdom, yet they proceed by sheer force. Alright, well, that's all I've got for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed the talk and that little addendum. Lastly, before leaving you, I'd like to thank Brett Bartlett for doing some quality control on this lecture before putting it up. He gave me a hand in the editing process to make sure I didn't say anything stupid. This is more his area of expertise than it is mine. So that's a big help to me in bringing you guys quality material. Anyhow, thanks again for joining me. You've been listening to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, and I'm Dan Attrell.